I had billions in the bank, a model on my arm, and I just kicked my wife out in the rain with nothing but the clothes on her back. I thought I was finally free. 6 months later, I walked into the most exclusive restaurant in New York, celebrating the biggest deal of my life, and there she was, my pregnant ex-wife, glowing, laughing, wearing emerald silk and sapphires, and holding hands with the one man in the world who could crush me like paper. My hand squeezed the wine glass so hard it snapped in two. But that wasn't even the worst moment. The worst moment came 3 years later on a freezing Chicago sidewalk when that same man pressed $100 bill into my shaking hand and said, "Stay warm." He had no idea who I was. And she just walked away without a word. Not angry, not satisfied, just done. This story will teach you something that money never could. The people you step on while climbing up are the same ones watching when you hit the ground. And sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply living beautifully. If this story hits you somewhere deep, drop a comment below, tell me what you would have done in her shoes. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story that actually means something.
The lights at a place called Lorraine weren't just fancy crystal. I used to love telling people they were pure diamond. It fit the story I told myself, the kid from Chicago who could turn nothing into everything. That night, I was at the best table, the one they saved for royalty. Across from me was Chloe, a model, 23 years old, gorgeous to look at, but about as deep as a puddle. She was just glued to her phone, swiping through pictures of herself. I finally had to say, "Chloe, put that away." My voice was quiet, but it had an edge. "We're celebrating," I told her. "The deal with Con and Kate is done. I'm officially in charge now." She glanced up, her big blue eyes totally vacant. "Oh, right. Good for you, honey. Does this mean we can get that house in Como? The one with the boat?" I just swirled the wine in my glass, feeling this deep, familiar ache. It was the feeling of being completely and utterly bored. "We can buy the whole lake," I muttered, but the words felt empty. It had been 6 months, you see. That's how long it had been since Emma and I divorced. Just thinking her name felt like swallowing dust. She was my college sweetheart, the girl who darned my socks when I couldn't afford new ones. She was the one who'd stay up all night checking my first business plans. But as my bank account got bigger, Emma stayed. Emma. She liked quiet nights, comfortable shoes. She didn't know how to play the game with investors or command a room. I told myself I'd outgrown her. I needed a trophy, not a partner. So I ended it, quickly and coldly. I remember that day perfectly. I handed her the divorce papers and a check, telling her she didn't fit in my life anymore. She didn't scream or cry. She just looked at me with this awful, deep sadness and whispered, "You'll learn the price of this, Brian," then walked out into the rain. "Brian, you're a million miles away," Chloe whined, tapping her fork on her glass. "I ordered lobster, but our waiter is totally ghosting me." "He's not ignoring you, he's just busy," I snapped, my patience gone. Then, suddenly, all the noise in the restaurant just stopped. The music, the chatter, everything. It wasn't a gradual thing. It was like someone hit a switch, followed by a collective gasp. I frowned. Lorraine got famous people all the time, but a hush like this? That meant real power had just walked in. "Who is that?" Chloe asked, craning her neck. "Is that an actor or something?" I turned just a little in my chair to see the entrance. The host, a guy named Pierre, who usually acted like he was better than everyone, was practically bowing. 2 people walked in, with 4 security guards moving like shadows. The man was tall, well over 6'2", in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car. He had that salt and pepper hair and a jawline you could cut glass on. I froze. I knew who he was. Everyone in my world did. That was Adrian Vance, the CEO of Vance Global, The man who owned the shipping lanes I used, the satellites I leased, the banks I borrowed from, he was old, powerful money. The kind of predator that other predators run from. But it wasn't Adrian that made the blood drain from my face. It was the woman on his arm. She was wearing this incredible gown, a shimmering emerald silk that fit her perfectly. Her hair, which she used to throw up in a messy bun, was flowing down her back in these perfect, glossy waves. And around her neck was a sapphire necklace that glittered like a blue star. It was Emma, but not the Emma I knew. The shy, quiet woman was gone. This woman held her head high, her eyes sweeping over the room with a calm, almost unnerving confidence. And then I saw it. The silk of her dress was cut to fit perfectly around the beautiful, round curve of her belly. She was very pregnant. My hand clenched my wine glass so hard, the stem just snapped. Red wine bled across the white tablecloth, looking just like a pool of blood. "Oh my God, Brian, look what you did," Chloe shrieked, jumping back so the wine wouldn't hit her dress. I didn't even hear her. There was just this roaring in my ears. Pregnant. She looked at least 7 months along. I did the math in my head. 6 months since we split. 7 months pregnant. The whole room felt like it was tilting. Was the baby mine, or had she really moved on that quickly? As the host walked Adrian and Emma through the restaurant, their path brought them right by my table. I was stuck. I couldn't even look away. I thought she'd look down, try to hide, make herself small like she used to. But instead, as they drew near, Emma's eyes locked with mine. There wasn't any fear in them. There wasn't any love, either. There was just this cool, smooth indifference, the way you'd look at a stranger on the subway. Adrian Vance put a gentle hand on her back, leaning in to whisper something in her ear. And Emma laughed. It was a bright, musical sound I hadn't heard from her in so many years. They swept right past us, leaving this faint scent of jasmine and very expensive cologne. "Wait a second," Chloe whispered, her eyes narrowed. "Isn't that your ex-wife? The one you said was kind of plain?" I just stared at the red stain spreading on the table. "Yes," I managed to say, my voice not sounding like my own at all. "That's Emma." A waiter rushed over to fix the mess, apologizing like it was his fault I'd lost control. I just waved him away, my appetite completely gone. "I don't get it," Chloe said, picking at her bread. "You told me she was broke, a nobody. So what's she doing with him? That's Adrian Vance. My dad says he could buy this whole city if he wanted to." "I don't know, Chloe," I snapped, loud enough that the table next to us looked over. I lowered my voice, my hands balled into fists under the table. "I don't know." Across the room, Adrian and Emma were seated at the private alcove table, the one even I could never book. It had this incredible view of the skyline. It also offered just enough privacy. I watched them. I couldn't stop. I saw Adrian pull out her chair for her. I saw how the staff treated her like she was a visiting queen. But the thing that really got to me was the way Adrian looked at her. It wasn't how a man looks at a beautiful prize. It was a look of pure, unconditional adoration. Especially when his hand moved to rest on her stomach after they sat down. That one little gesture. It was possessive, protective, and fatherly, all at once. My mind was screaming. Is it his child? It couldn't be. We were together 7 months ago. It has to be mine. But she never told me anything. Suddenly, this wave of ownership washed over me. If that was my heir, I had a right to know. I was Brian Thorne. People didn't keep secrets from me. "I'm just going to the restroom." I saw him get up from across the restaurant, you know. His little date, Chloe, was pulling at his sleeve, probably wanting dessert, but he just ignored her. He started walking right for us, not to the men's room, but straight to our private little corner. Looking back, I can only guess how he must have felt. As he got near, two of Adrian's security men, bless their hearts, just materialized and blocked his path. He tried that big CEO voice on them, ordering them to move. One of them said, in this perfectly bored tone, that Mr. Vance wasn't taking visitors. Then Adrian's voice, but calm as ever, called out, "Let him through, Marcus." And just like that, they stepped aside. He walked in, and I just kept looking at my menu. I knew I looked good, you know? That pregnancy glow they talk about is real. I felt healthier than I ever had when I was with him. "Emma," he said, his voice all tight. I slowly set the menu down and met his eyes. I tried to keep my own, very, very calm. "Hello, Brian," I said. "I had a feeling you'd be making your way over." He just blurted out, "You're pregnant." I remember smiling a little at that. "Just as sharp as ever," I told him. His eyes darted to Adrian, who was just enjoying his drink, smiling like the cat that got the cream. Then Brian looked back at my belly. "Is it mine?" he asked. And honey, I just had to laugh. "Yours?" I told him. "Brian, you lost the right to ask me that question the night you kicked me out of our house at 11 o'clock because you said I didn't have vision." He got angry then, hissing about his rights and his lawyers. He took a step toward me, but then Adrian spoke. He didn't yell or even get up. He just said, "Sit down, boy." And the power in his voice. It just stopped Brian cold. "Mr. Thorne," Adrian said, just swirling the ice in his glass, "you seem to be confused about a few things. Let me help you. First, you will not raise your voice to my fiancé. It's not good for the baby." That word, fiancé, felt like a shield. Adrian continued, telling him, "As for who the father is, you were a little too preoccupied with your Instagram model to notice your own wife that last year, weren't you?" He pointed out that Brian had barely touched me. "We both know how it was, Brian," he said, "so don't pretend to be the devoted husband now." Brian's face got so red. He looked at me, almost begging. "Emma, you have to tell him. Tell him what I meant to you." I remember how gentle my own voice sounded. "I already did, Brian." I put a hand on my belly. "I told him you were the kind of man who needed me to feel small so you could feel big. I told him how you called me worthless." Then I reached for Adrian's hand, and then Adrian showed me I was priceless. That's when Brian just snapped, yelling about money. He said it was all about leaving a millionaire for a billionaire, that I was just a gold digger. It was like all the air went out of the room. Adrian set his glass down, and the little click sounded like a firecracker. "Be very careful," he said, his voice low. "You're speaking to the chairwoman of the Vance Foundation. She's not like you, Brian. She built her life from the ruins you made." Right then, of course, Chloe came clicking over in her ridiculously high heels, whining about how long he was taking. She looked at me, and her eyes got all catty. "Oh, it's you," she smirked. "Wow. You really let yourself go. I guess the divorce was hard on you." It got so quiet, you could hear a pin drop, but it didn't bother me. I just gave her this slow, sad smile. "And you must be Chloe," I said. "Brian always did like shiny things with no substance." She gasped, so offended. "You can have him," I said, turning back to my menu. "He's your problem now. But here's a little free advice, honey. Read that prenuptial agreement very, very closely. Brian is awfully protective of his money." That's when Adrian let out this deep, dark laugh. "Marcus," he said, "get them out of here. They're ruining my appetite." And that was that. The big guard just stepped in front of them. "This isn't over, Emma," Brian snarled as he was led away. He was shouting about his child in court and how he would ruin me. That's when Adrian finally stood up. He was so much taller than Brian. He leaned in close to him, and said something I'll never forget. If you ever bother her again, if you even look her way, I won't just sue you. I will buy your company, break it into 1,000,000 pieces, and leave you with nothing but that cheap suit. And Brian just crumbled. He had to go back to his table, while Chloe whined in his ear. I saw him just sitting there, staring at the empty chair where his whole future was supposed to be, watching me, laughing with a billionaire, carrying a child that would one day inherit 2 fortunes. For the first time in his life, I think, Brian Thorne felt completely and utterly powerless. But the night wasn't finished. As he was trying to get the check, I saw a man in a gray suit walk over to our table. He was a process server. Brian was watching, probably hoping it was for Adrian, but the man walked right past Adrian and stopped at Brian's table. "Are you Brian Thorne?" he asked. "Yes." "You've been served," the man said, putting a thick envelope on the table. Brian tore it open. His hands were shaking. You see, the lawsuit wasn't from Adrian. It was from me. The plaintiff was listed as Emma Vance Cross, and the lawsuit was for the theft of the Thorne algorithmic model. I heard later that all the color just drained from his face. That algorithm. The code that made him his first $1 billion. The code he always claimed he wrote, but was actually something I put together in our little college dorm room 10 years before. I didn't just come back for my life, you see. I came back for everything. The next morning, in his big fancy office, he was apparently a wreck. His top lawyer, a man named Marcus Sterling, who usually looked so calm, was panicking. Brian just kept saying, "You've got to be kidding me. She was a literature major." He used to say I was only good for checking his emails for spelling mistakes. He never saw what was right in front of him. Sterling told him their tech people had analyzed the source code, the very foundation of his company. Deep inside it, they found some hidden notes. When they pulled it up on the screen, there it was, a little message left by the programmer. It said, "For Brian, so you can finally get some sleep tonight. Love, E." And he just stared at it. The memory must have hit him like a ton of bricks. It was from 7 years before, when he was about to fail a class because his program wouldn't work. He'd fallen asleep on our lumpy old sofa, just completely exhausted. When he woke up, the code was fixed. I was sitting there with some coffee, and I just told him I'd tinkered with it a little. He thought I'd fixed a typo. He never once imagined I had rewritten the entire thing from scratch. But here's the kicker. His lawyer told him that I had copyrighted that exact code under the name Ghostwriter 3 days before his company ever launched. I was the legal owner of it all, honey, and I was asking a judge to shut his servers down. He apparently screamed, knocking his chair over. He knew that if the servers went dark, his company was done. The stock would crash. Thorntech would be bankrupt in a week. His lawyer told him he had to make a deal to offer me anything I wanted. Because I had the proof, and I had Adrian Vance's legal team, they would have torn him apart. I can just see him, standing at that big window, looking out over a city he thought he owned. And then his phone buzzed. It was Chloe. Her credit card had been declined at Gucci, and she was demanding he fix it because everyone was staring. He threw the phone against the wall. He couldn't accept it. He was Brian Thorne, the visionary. Not some fraud whose entire career was built on the work of the wife he threw away. I remember asking Sterling where she was, my voice tight with an urgency I didn't recognize at the time. He told me she was hosting some silver gala at the museum that night, a charity for single mothers, of all things. The tickets were $20,000 apiece. "Get me one," I demanded. He tried to talk sense into me, mentioning the restraining order. "Just get me the ticket," I yelled back. I was so sure so foolishly sure that I could fix everything if I could just speak to her. Away from Vance, I thought I could remind her of the woman she used to be. Looking back, Sterling's expression told me everything I needed to know, but I was blind to it then. He just pulled out his phone and got to work. The museum, my dear, it was like a dream, all silver and white. The city's most important people floated through the halls, glasses of champagne in hand. I'd come by myself, leaving Chloe at home because I wanted to play the part of the regretful husband. I put on my best suit, but I'd never felt more like a fraud. Every whispered conversation I passed felt like it was about me and my failing company. I scanned that crowded room, searching for the emerald green she always loved, but she wasn't wearing green. She was in silver. There she was on a stage near that old Egyptian temple, addressing the whole party. She wore a silver gown that clung to her pregnant belly and flowed around her like moonlight. She looked like a queen, so powerful and completely out of my reach. Then she announced that the Vance Foundation was donating $50 million for legal aid to women in unfair divorces. Her voice was steady as a rock. The room burst into applause, and I felt a wave of nausea. That money, that whole charity, was a dagger pointed right at me. As she came down from the stage, swarmed by admirers, I saw my chance. I pushed through the clusters of people, ignoring the icy stares from old rivals. "Emma!" I shouted, just as her security team was about to whisk her away. She stopped. The crowd around us just parted, creating a little circle. It was the public scene everyone had been dying to see. She turned around, so very slowly, and for once, Adrian wasn't by her side. He was across the room with a senator. This was my moment. "Brian," she said, and her face was like a mask, impossible to read. "You actually bought a ticket. How thoughtful." She then added, "I'll just count that $20,000 as a down payment on your alimony." Some people nearby laughed. I moved closer, my voice low and urgent. "Emma, please, I have to speak with you privately." "I have nothing to say to you that can't be said in a courtroom," she replied, her tone pure ice. "This is about the company," I begged. "You're going to ruin it. Think of all the people who will lose their jobs. I know you're mad, but don't punish them. That isn't you." "You're a good person," I said, trying to reach the woman I once knew. "You're the kind of woman who rescues stray cats." Her eyes lit up with a fire I'd never seen. The woman who rescued stray cats ceased to exist the night she had to sleep in her car because her husband canceled all her credit cards. A gasp went through the crowd. I felt the blood drain from my face. That was a secret I had prayed would stay buried. "I didn't realize you had nowhere to go," I stammered out. "I thought you were with your parents." "My parents passed away, Brian. You knew that perfectly well. It just didn't matter to you." She stepped right up to me, her voice a dangerous whisper. "As for the company you call yours, it's not. My code is its foundation. My mind and my work built it. You were just the pretty face, Brian. And now I'm ripping that mask away." "Emma, wait," I pleaded, grabbing her hand. It was my last desperate move. "What about our child? If you ruin me, you ruin his future. That baby is mine, right? You know in your heart that he needs me." She glanced down at my hand on her arm, and then her eyes met mine. She didn't pull away. A smile touched her lips, but it was cold and hollow. "You really want to discuss the baby, Brian?" "Yes," I gasped, thinking I'd finally found a crack in her armor. "It's my right." "All right," she declared, her voice ringing out for everyone nearby to hear. "The evening you threw me out, I was holding a small gift. Do you remember that?" I searched my memory, my brow furrowed. I did remember. She'd been holding a little white box. I'd slapped it out of her hand, so desperate to get her out before Chloe arrived. "I recall," I whispered. That box, Emma continued, her voice shaking with controlled rage, contained a positive pregnancy test and a tiny pair of baby shoes. I was trying to tell you we were starting a family, but you just stared at me and ordered me to take my garbage and leave. The whole world tilted on its axis, and all the color drained from my vision. So don't stand there acting like you care about being a father, she seethed. You turned your back on your own child before you even knew he existed. But he has a father now, a true man who comforted me, who was there for every doctor's visit, and who built the nursery himself. That's different, I protested. But my voice had no conviction. Biology is important. Biology only makes you the source, Brian. It is love that makes a man a father. Just then, a firm hand landed on my shoulder. It was Adrian Vance, who had crossed the room with an almost silent speed. Is everything all right over here? He asked, his tone quiet but full of menace. We're just having a conversation, I said, trying to shrug off his grip. It wouldn't budge. It was like a steel clamp. It appeared to me that you were causing my wife distress, Adrian stated. She is not your wife at this moment, I shot back, my jealousy boiling over. Adrian simply smiled. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded document, and tucked it neatly into my chest pocket. Review this when you step outside. It is a copy of the adoption agreement. I legally adopted the child 2 weeks ago while still in the womb, with Emma's full consent. The court approved it, citing proven abandonment by the biological source. I could only stare, completely stunned. You're not allowed to do that. I am Adrian Vance, he said plainly. There is nothing I cannot do. Now get out of my sight before I have security throw you down the front steps. Defeated and overcome with shame, I fled. I could feel the stares of New York's most powerful people on my back as I stumbled into the night air. Near Central Park, I pulled the document from my pocket. It was more than an adoption paper. A DNA analysis was attached. Subject, Brian Thorne. Finding, 0% chance of paternity. I stood perfectly still. I reread the words, 0%. My eyes scanned the page until I saw the doctor's note at the bottom. It said I had a congenital issue that made me incapable of fathering children, a condition I'd likely had since my teens. The paper slipped from my fingers. I wasn't the father. I never could have been. It was impossible. But if I was unable to have children, and Emma was expecting, then who? Suddenly it all became clear. The dates, the work trip Emma took by herself a year ago to the West Coast, where Vance Global's headquarters was. She hadn't just met Adrian 6 months ago. The New York rain began to fall then. It doesn't cleanse anything, you know. It only makes the filth more slippery. I think I just collapsed, right there on the pavement. I found myself in front of an exclusive fertility clinic, the big oak door thudding shut behind me. I had stormed in there, demanding answers, threatening lawsuits, yelling that the DNA report was a fake. The doctor, an older man who had no patience for the tantrums of rich men, was not impressed. He simply pulled my medical records from 20 years prior, from a time when I was a teenager and very sick. I informed your parents at the time, Mr. Thorne, the doctor said, pushing up his glasses. The internal damage was complete. You have always been incapable of having children. We operated under the assumption that you were aware. I wandered in the downpour after that, my expensive Italian shoes splashing through puddles. I hadn't been aware, or maybe on some level, I had chosen to forget the truth. For 5 long years, I had let Emma carry all the blame. Every month she wasn't pregnant, I would sigh and give her that look of disappointment. I convinced her she was the problem. I made her see doctors, take hormones that made her sick, and feel ashamed when nothing happened. All that time, I was the one who was broken. My hands were shaking as I hailed a taxi. I had to get home. I had to tell Chloe. And that thought jolted me. Chloe was with me for one reason: the empire I had promised her. An empire I had promised we'd have an heir to inherit. I suppose the end really began on a Tuesday, the kind of rainy day that soaks you right through to the bone. I walked into the penthouse, and the place was a disaster. Shopping bags everywhere, Chanel, Hermes, you name it. And there was Chloe, lounging on the sofa amidst it all, shouting into her phone, "I don't care that the card was declined. Run it again. Do you have any idea who I'm dating?" She finally noticed me, dripping all over the marble floor. "Brian, there you are. You have to fix my credit card. This is just so humiliating." In that moment, I saw her. I mean, really saw her for the first time. She was beautiful, no doubt, but it was like looking at a perfect, hollow doll. There was no love in her eyes, just calculation. "Chloe," I said, my voice calmer than I felt, "it's time for you to pack." She let out this sharp, brittle laugh. "Oh, are we finally going to Paris?" "No," I said, and I walked over and kicked a Chanel box clear across the room. "You're leaving. Now." Her face twisted into a snarl I'd never seen before. "You can't be serious. You think you can just toss me out like you did your ex-wife?" Hearing Emma's name from her lips was like a punch to the gut. "My ex-wife," I managed to say, "was worth 10 of you. She helped build me. All you do is take. Get out." "Fine," she shrieked, knocking a pile of jewelry off a table. "You're no fun anymore anyway. And for the record," she yelled from the door, "everyone laughs at you. You walk around like a king, but you're just a walking ATM. I've heard the whispers, Brian. You're about to be a poor man, and trust me, poverty is not your color." Then she was gone, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. I was alone. I poured myself a drink and just stood there, watching the city lights. I'd ruined my marriage for a woman who cared nothing for me, and pushed away the only one who ever truly believed in me. But then, honey, the grief curdled into something ugly. A cold, vicious anger took its place, Emma. She had to have known. If she was pregnant and it wasn't mine, because I couldn't have children, it meant one thing. The timing gnawed at me. 6 months divorced, but 7 months pregnant. It felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than anything else. She'd been with someone else while we were still married. I let out this horrible, empty laugh. Saint Emma, the perfect wife, was a cheater. That's what I told myself. So I picked up my phone and called a man I hadn't spoken to in years, a slimy gossip columnist named Barry, who owed me. "Barry," I said, my voice low and dangerous, "I have a story for you. The real story of Adrian Vance and Emma Cross." I told him everything, twisting it into a tale of a billionaire who stole another man's wife and a saint who was pregnant by another man while still in her husband's bed. "That's dynamite, Brian," he said. You could hear the greed in his voice. "But you have proof of the timeline?" "The baby is all the proof you need," I lied. "Publish it. If she sues, I'll make sure she's too ashamed to show her face." After I hung up, I felt this dark, satisfying calm. If my world was coming down, I was going to pull them all down with me. The next day, the headline was brutal: "Billionaire Baby Scandal." The story painted me as the victim, a devoted husband betrayed by a cheating wife who'd seduced a richer man. It hinted the baby was conceived from an affair right under my own roof. I sat in my office, watching the storm I'd created on social media. People were turning on her, calling her a gold digger, questioning Adrian's morals. "This will force a settlement," I told my lawyer, Marcus Sterling, who looked like he was about to be sick. "They'll drop the lawsuit just to make this go away," I insisted. Marcus, bless him, just stared at his tablet, his face pale. "Brian," he said, his voice strained. "You need to see this. Vance Global just announced a press conference. It's going live." I turned my chair to the giant screen on my wall. There was Adrian Vance at a podium. He didn't look worried or angry. He looked like a man about to deliver a verdict. And Emma was standing right beside him. She wasn't hiding. She looked straight at the camera, and her eyes were filled with fire. "Earlier today," Adrian began, his voice filling the room, "a desperate man tried to use the media to bully a pregnant woman. That man is Brian Thorne. He accused me of destroying a happy home." Adrian paused, looking right through the screen at me. "We were expecting this," he said. "Liars always assume everyone else is a liar, too." He stepped aside, and Emma took his place. "I never cheated on Brian Thorne," she said, her voice steady as a rock. "For 7 years, I was a faithful wife. I supported him when we had nothing. I was the one writing the code that made him a billionaire while he slept." She held up a document. "This is a medical report from the Mayo Clinic dated 8 months ago, a month before our divorce. It shows I underwent 1 round of IVF treatment using a donor." I just froze. "IVF. I did that," she continued, her voice trembling just slightly, "because my husband desperately wanted a child but refused to see a doctor himself. I wanted to surprise him with the family he always said he wanted. I paid for all of it with my own money. I went through the shots, everything, all alone." The silence in that press conference was deafening, and it filled my office too. "I found out the treatment worked," Emma said, a single tear finally escaping. "On the same day, Brian served me with divorce papers. I tried to tell him. He wouldn't listen. He threw me out of our home. I was pregnant with nowhere to go. That's when Adrian Vance found me. He didn't steal me from you, Brian. You threw me away. He just picked up the treasure you were too blind to see." Adrian stepped back to the microphone. "As for the company," he said, "Mr. Thorne forgot one detail about the software he stole." My stomach dropped. Emma didn't just write the program. She protected it, Adrian said, a cold smile playing on his lips. "There's a fail-safe hidden in the code, a kill switch, designed to activate if an unauthorized user, Brian, tried to alter the core files, which his IT department did this morning, trying to hide his theft." He looked at his watch. "The kill switch activates in 3, 2, 1. In my office, the lights flickered. The hum of the servers died. My monitor went black. "Sir!" my assistant screamed, bursting in. "The platform, the app, it's all gone. The code is deleting itself." I slammed my hands on the keyboard, but there was nothing. Nothing but a black screen and a few green words. "Error, user unauthorized. Goodbye, Brian." On the TV, Adrian leaned in. "Thorntech is now an empty shell with 0 assets. Its stock is in free fall. I've also contacted the SEC with proof of Mr. Thorne's embezzlement to fund his mistress's lifestyle." His eyes were like chips of ice. "Checkmate, Brian." The broadcast ended. I just sat there in the dead quiet of my office. My phone began to ring, the board, the SEC, the bank. I didn't answer. I walked to the window and looked down at the city I thought I owned. I had always wanted to be a king. I always wanted to be feared, and I got my wish. I was feared, all right, as a cautionary tale. Far below, I saw a black SUV pull up. A small figure in a green coat got in, helped by a tall man. Even from that distance, I could see how gentle he was with her. Emma. She had won. She didn't just beat me, she erased me. I sank to the floor, the silence of that empty office pressing in on me. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a crumpled old photo I'd carried for years. It was me and Emma back in college, eating pizza on our dorm room floor, laughing. We had nothing, but I looked so happy. I realized right then, under the crushing weight of my own ruin, that was the richest I'd ever been. And I'd traded it all for glitter and glass that was never really mine. In the world I used to run, 3 years is an eternity. Companies are born, empires fall, and names are forgotten. For me, those 3 years felt like 300. It wasn't a quick end. It was a slow, public dismantling of a life. The SEC investigation dragged on for 18 months, stripping away every last shred of my dignity. They took the penthouse first, then the cars, the art. I remember just standing there, watching them confiscate my watch collection, piece by piece. You know, it all fell apart in a single moment. I remember a man in a cheap windbreaker picking up my watch, the one I bought with my first 10 million, and tossing it into an evidence bag like a cheap toy. That was when Chloe left. She didn't pack, just ordered a car and said, "You're bad for my brand." 3 years after that, I was freezing on a Chicago sidewalk. That wind off the lake is no joke. It goes right through you. I wasn't Brian Thorne, the tech genius, anymore. I was Jules, the low man on the valet totem pole at the Grand Plaza Hotel, and my boss, a 20-year-old kid named Manny, was yelling at me to wake up. Manny spent all his time vaping and watching videos online. He had no clue who I used to be. I was just the quiet, gray-haired guy who was a little slow and had shaky hands. "I'm awake," I mumbled, trying to stomp some life back into my feet. My shoes were soaked straight through. "Big night," Manny said, blowing a cloud of strawberry vapor in my face. "The future of Tech Gala. These cars cost more than your life, old man, so don't scratch anything." I just winced. 5 years earlier, I was the keynote speaker at that very gala. I could still feel the heat of the spotlight, hear the sound of the applause as I talked about changing the world. I remembered Emma, your grandmother, sitting in the front row, looking up at me with a pride I now realize I never deserved. I'd made her wear a simple blue dress that night, telling her the designer one she loved was too flashy. But on this night, I was just the help. The hotel doors swung open, spilling out light and music and the smell of incredible food. It was a cruel thing, really, because my stomach was aching. I'd skipped lunch to save $5 for the electric bill. Then the guests started coming out, and I saw Marcus Sterling, my old lawyer. He looked right through me as he handed me a ticket for his Mercedes. I kept my head down, pulled my cap low, and got his car. I took his $2 tip without a word. There's a special kind of misery in being invisible in a world you used to rule. "Heads up," Manny hissed. "We've got a whale." He mentioned the name Vance, and my heart just stopped. My first instinct was to run, to hide, to do anything to disappear. But I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the sidewalk by a strange mix of dread and morbid curiosity. Then this massive black SUV pulled up, flanked by security cars. It wasn't just a car. It looked like a rolling fortress, and the engine's hum vibrated right through me. "Jules, get the door," Manny barked, busy flirting. My hands were trembling so badly I had to clasp them behind my back for a second. When I walked up to the passenger door, I saw my own reflection. A tired, hollow-looking man who looked 20 years older than his actual 35. I pulled the heavy handle, and a wave of warmth that smelled of leather and jasmine flowed out. The first thing I saw was a handmade Italian shoe. Then Adrian Vance stepped out. Time had been incredibly kind to him. He seemed more powerful than ever. He was broader, with sharp salt and pepper hair, and he moved like he owned the ground he stood on. He didn't look at me, just turned back to the car and offered his hand. "Careful, love. It's icy." The hand that took his... Well, I knew that hand better than my own. I knew how it felt, smoothing my hair or scrubbing our dishes in that first tiny apartment. Then Emma stepped out. The breath just left my body. She was magnificent. The quiet woman I remembered was gone. In her place was a queen in a deep crimson gown, wrapped in a coat that looked like fallen snow. Her hair was styled perfectly, and she wore these tasteful, elegant diamonds. But it wasn't the clothes that stunned me. It was her face. The worry lines I had put there were gone, replaced by this deep, beautiful peace. She looked so loved. Then a little voice from the car said, "Wait for me." And I froze. A little boy, no older than 3, bundled up in a tiny coat, was climbing out. He had dark, curly hair and big, curious eyes. Adrian let out this deep, warm laugh, a sound I'd never heard from him, and said, "We didn't forget you, Leo? Come on over, champ." Adrian scooped the boy into his arms like it was the most natural thing in the world. The boy giggled and hugged him tight. "Daddy, did you see the robot with the lasers?" he asked. "I sure did," Adrian said, kissing his head. "But I think you liked the cookies more." Leo announced very seriously, "I like cookies." Emma laughed and brushed a snowflake from his nose. "You are 100% your father's son," she said. Your father's son. Those words echoed in that empty place where my pride used to be. Because Leo wasn't my son. The doctors had made that painfully clear. All my talk about legacy, about building a dynasty, about the Thorn name, it was all just hot air. The real legacy was right in front of me. A happy child, raised by a man who earned respect without ever demanding it. I was just standing there, by the open car door, unable to move. I should have just faded back into the shadows, but I couldn't take my eyes off that little boy. He had his mother's smile. And then he saw me. He looked right at me, and he didn't see a failure or a fraud. He just saw a man in a funny hat. "Hi," he said, and waved his little mitten. That simple sound, it just cracked open something inside me. My eyes started burning, and my throat closed up. I wanted to say hello back, but I couldn't. Emma turned, following her son's gaze, and then her eyes fell on me. For a second, the whole world went silent. It wasn't some big dramatic scene. She didn't gasp. Her eyes just widened slightly as she took in the cheap uniform, the wet shoes, and the name tag that read Jules. I braced myself, expecting her to sneer or laugh or point me out to her husband. A part of me almost wished she would. Anger would have meant I still mattered, even in a bad way. But Emma didn't get angry. Her expression just softened, and she looked at me with this profound, soul-crushing sadness. It was the look you give a stray animal that's been hurt too much to ever trust again. It was pure, detached pity. She didn't say my name or ask how I was. She just turned back to her husband and her child. "It's freezing out here, Adrian," she said softly. "Let's get Leo inside. He's starting to shiver." Adrian agreed, and then turned to me. He had no idea who I was. To him, I was just some forgotten character from the first chapter of his life with Emma. So unimportant, I didn't even register. "Great service," he said, his voice polite. He reached into his pocket, took out a bill, and pressed it firmly into my hand. "Stay warm," he said. I looked down. It was a brand new, crisp $100 bill. Benjamin Franklin seemed to be mocking me. "Thank you, sir," I whispered, my voice a broken sound I barely recognized. Adrian just nodded and led his family into the hotel. A car was waiting there to take them to the airport. "Bye-bye, Leo," the little one chirped over his father's shoulder, waving his tiny hand at me. I think I managed to raise a hand back. A small, weak little wave. "Bye," I mouthed. But no sound came out. I watched them walk away, I saw Adrian lean over, whisper something to Emma, and then she rested her head right on his shoulder. They fit together, like two pieces of a puzzle, a little world of their own, all warmth and love. They were a family. And me? I was just the guy holding the door. When those big glass doors swung shut, the silence of the street just crashed in on me, and the wind, oh, it howled around that building. I just stood there, staring at the $100 bill in my hand. It's funny, in my old life, I might have lit a cigar with a bill like this. I'd have tipped a waitress that much just for pouring water, and I would have thought it was nothing. But now that single piece of paper was the difference between eating a hot meal or going hungry for the night. It was heat or shivering in my little apartment. I held on to it so tight my knuckles turned white. And then this feeling started to build up inside my chest, sharp and painful, and I couldn't stop it. I just sort of slumped against the cold stone of the hotel, sliding right down to the wet pavement. I'd spent my whole life building a fortress out of money, thinking it made me strong, but it only kept everyone away. People were just numbers on a spreadsheet to me then. I even pushed away the only woman who ever really saw me, and for what? All because I wanted a life that looked good on a magazine cover. I thought I wanted to be some kind of king, but sitting there on the cold ground, I finally got it. Kings are just men in fancy clothes. Real power, the kind that matters, isn't a crown. It's having a hand to hold when everything gets cold and scary. Emma had found her hand to hold. All I had were my own, stuffed deep in my pockets. "Hey, Jules," Manny shouted from the valet stand. He had no idea what was going on with me. "Stop daydreaming. We got a Corolla coming in. Chop, chop." I remember wiping my face with the rough sleeve of my coat and taking a long, shaky breath. That freezing air burned my lungs, and it snapped me right back to reality. "Coming?" I managed to croak out as I pushed myself up. I tried to straighten out that cheap, baggy jacket they made us wear. I took that $100 bill, a handout from my ex-wife's new husband, and tucked it into my pocket, right next to my bus pass. Then I walked over to the beat-up Corolla that was pulling in. I opened the door, forced a smile I didn't feel, and bowed my head. "Welcome to the Grand Plaza," I whispered. "How can I help you?" And that, my dear, was how it all ended for Brian Thorne. There wasn't some big explosion or a dramatic scene. It was just a slow, quiet freezing, realizing I was the one who had locked myself in my own prison. I spent a lifetime chasing things that cost a lot, but never understood what was truly valuable. I threw away a diamond because I was too busy chasing glitter, and by the time I realized my mistake, that diamond was already shining in someone else's life. It's a tough lesson the world teaches you. Sometimes, the real consequences aren't about something bad happening to you, but about all the good you miss out on. I didn't get the family, or the love, or leave anything behind that mattered. I just got a tip. You know, I've always wondered about the look Emma gave me. It was pity. Do you think that hurt more than if she'd yelled at me? Is being forgotten the realest way to be paid back for your mistakes? If you were in her shoes, what would you have done? Would you have said something, or was just walking away the kindest thing she could do? It's something I've thought about for years. That moment taught me so much about grace, something I never had. So, thank you for listening to this old man's story. And always remember this little piece of advice. Be kind to the people you meet on your way up in the world. You just might need to see them again on your way back down. This journey of mine, it was a hard one, but it was carefully planned by a force bigger than me, I think. It taught me a lesson that I hope brings a little value to you now, just by me telling it. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.